Introduction of UAE.
UAE is a country located in Middle East. UAE was formed from a federal of 7 Emirates including Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Fujairah, Al Quwain, and Al Qaimah. Abu Dhabi is the political capital and the richest emirate, while Dubai is the commercial center. UAE is one of the world's wealthiest countries. UAE has never been a serious political turmoil since its establishment in 1971. UAE is a federation country, and the federal government has control of such issues as national issues as defense, foreign policy, immigration, labor and social affairs, education, and health. In 2000, population estimates of the UAE is exceeding 2.6 million, which is about 85% of the country's population is urban. The populations of UAE increasing in a large number of every year, including foreign workers from the different continents across the globe. UAE's current population is 10.08 million. As in 2020, UN estimates immigrants to take up to 88% of the total UAE population. For current economic landscape, UAE boasts one of the world's most open economies. It is rich with natural resources, accounting for 10% of global oil reserves and the world's 5th largest natural gas reserves. As a mainstay of the economy, oil and natural gas exports now account for taking up more than a quarter of UAE's GDP. UAE's economic diversification program has led to the rise of several non-oil sectors in the past 2 decades that now make up a significant percentage of UAE's GDP. Manufacturing 12.6%, commerce and hotels 11.4%, real estate 9.1%, construction 8.6%, transportation 7.3%, and finance and insurance 6.4%. Dubai has succeeded in attracting high-profile technology firms to Emirates Internet City, including Microsoft, Oracle, Hewlett-Packard, and Cisco System. The UAE's GDP reached $412.14 billion by the end of 2019, an increase of only 0.2%. Due to the pandemic outbreak and the sharp fall in the oil prices in the first half of 2020, the GDP performance fell by 6.1%, and as a result, other statistics has suffered, including the fall in FDI and GDP per capita, as well as a rise in public debt. However, in 2021, the GDP grew up to 3.8%, which is higher than the rate of growth in 2019. For major economic drivers, the economy of UAE is highly dependent on oil. UAE is beginning to see the emergence of local manufacturing as a new source of economic development. In terms of foreign commerce, UAE's market is one of the most active in the world, ranking among top 16 exporters and 20 importers of goods. In 2021, the UAE aims to strengthen its commercial ties with neighboring states, particularly in Asia and Africa. UAE claimed that it aimed to attract $150 billion in foreign direct investment by 2030. The collapse of oil and gas industry during the COVID-19 crisis has caused delays in government plans and objectives that were supposed to be completed by 2020. Several businesses have suffered large financial losses as a result of the pandemic outbreak. Therefore, government intervened in the commercial market to save these businesses by enacting appropriate policies.
Industrial Relations System in the UAE.
First, let's talk about the employment law of the UAE. In this country, there are 2 different labor laws for both private and public sectors. Federal Law No. 8 of 1980, also called as the UAE Labor Code, is the law that governs the relationship between employer and employee of the private sectors, no matter they are UAE nations or expat. The establishment of the law is to ensure the employee rights and benefits that the company should respond to. Working hours, leaves, terminations of employment, and etc. are all encompassed under this law. While for the public sector, the amended labor law is named Federal Decree Law No. 11 of 2008. Civil servants whose salary paid from the federal budget, as well as civil workers employed by the federal agency and corporations, are regulated by this law. The existence of the free zones within the federations, however, complicates the UAE labor legislation. There are certain types of employees, such as those employed in the UAE free zone, are exempt from the UAE labor code and may be subject to alternative law. As a case in point, the dispute cases of free zone workers should report to the relevant free zone authorities rather than their company, and the issue will then refer to the Ministry of Labour. Next, the employment contract is not required to be written for the UAE nationals. However, expatriate employee will only be able to get a labor permit from the ministry if they have a formal written labor contract from their employer. There are 2 types of employment contract recognized by the federal labor law, which are the fixed-term contract and the open-ended contract. All of the contract must include the statements in the slides. In the UAE, there is still no independent trade union, as it has been treated as illegal in the Emirates. The existing labour law prohibits the formation of trade unions. Besides, labour law of the UAE also restricts the right to collectively bargain and strike. For example, to avoid bargaining and strike, wages are fixed in the individual contract and needs to be reviewed by the Ministry of the Labour. However, the government has permitted some professional associations to raise work-related concerns, lobby governments for redress, and register grievance. But these professional associations are constrained under the strict control of the ministry. Since there are no trade union in UAE, the International Trade Union Confederations (ITUC) has no affiliated there. In short, the UAE prohibits trade unions and collective bargaining as it was considered to be a threat to the nations by causing disputes within the nation and will damage the defense system of the country. Here are some dispute matters in the UAE based on the Labour Code. Children under the age of 15 are forbidden to work, and children below 17 are not able to conduct dangerous work. Since 1981, the CEACR has pushed the governments to change this order, setting the minimum age for hazardous labor at 18 years of the age by listing out the jobs that consist risky and threatens health and morality. Yet, it is still illegal tourism since it haven't been adopted until this day. Moreover, a report indicates that there is an inadequate uniforms contract for foreign domestic employees, which has had minimal impact on the reality of domestic employees. The aim of proposing the contract is to ensure adequate living and working conditions for foreign workers. In the year 2008, the UAE government and central banks developed a wage protection system and also established a mandatory minimum dwelling requirements in the year 2009. However, the sponsoring system exposed migrant workers to exploitations and different forms of forced labor. They are forced to work in longer hours in challenging conditions, are mistreated, and are frequently unpaid for months.
Employment statistics.
Employment statistic of UAE. According to UAE Population Statistic 2022, the total number of population in UAE is 10.08 million people. In 2018, the total labor force of UAE recorded as 7.384 million, and the total number of people employed was 7.219 million. As for employment rate of the UAE, there is a graph of employment rate, and the employment to population ratio is the proportion of the country population that is employed. Age 15 and older are generally considered the working age population. The total number of employment to population ratio has a surge, increasing from 73.18% in 1999 to 79.25% in 2016. After that, the graph is declined dramatically, especially in 2019 and 2020 due to COVID-19 pandemic. And in 2010, the employment to population ratio in UAE was recorded as 73.27% and started to increase to 73.86% in 2021. We move to the unemployment rate of the UAE. The graph shows the rise of oil price from a spike in economic development project in the UAE, causing a national labor shortage that originated in the public sector. This means that there are a huge demand for foreign labor in the UAE, and this situation was confirmed in 1980. The UAE has a high unemployment rate due to the population pressure and ongoing migration of national and expat. The unemployment has become a major worry due to population expansion and increase in the number of high school and university graduates. Unemployment was negatively influenced by both the economy and society. Next, for the presence of foreign worker in the UAE. The UAE is the one of the most popular place in the world of migrant seeking employment. It is quite evident that the aspirate outnumber of the national in the UAE. Today, UAE have more than 200 nationalities are present. According to the Migrant Policy Institute, the expat population account for 88.55%, which is around 8.92 million, and the national only consists of 11.48% with the amount of 1.16 million. The majority of low-skilled and semi-skilled workers come from Asia, the Middle East. For policy for employment of domestic worker and foreign worker, according to the Human Rights Watch, the United Arab Emirates moved to adopt a new law that will guarantee domestic worker a weekly rest day and paid leave is long overdue. After the bill become law, the Human Resource and Emiratization Ministry should develop implementing regulation that will bring the country into line with the International Labour Organization (ILO) Domestic Worker Convention by ensuring that migrant domestic workers enjoy the same labor protection as other workers in the UAE. Domestic labor law established the principle of informed consent to ensure that workers are aware of the term of the contract before they cross their national border. The UAE domestic labor law regulates 4 key areas in this protection of domestic worker. One is contracts, second is right and privilege, third is prohibition, and fourth is recruitment agency. Last but not least, the foreigner wishing to work in the UAE must to take note the requirement and condition for to work in the UAE. They must have first is passport and visa, health screening, certification attestation, additional tests, restrict profession, the right and duties.
There are three sectors of employment in UAE, which are agriculture, manufacturing and service sector. Agriculture in the UAE is carried out on a total area of around 160,000 hectares, most of which is taken by farms. Over the year, the government in each emirate have provided incentive to farmers to increase the production. The rapid development of agriculture in the UAE was seen during the 1980s when the country started using up to 30% of it for food requirement. There has also been an increase in fishing and poultry production, which local dairy meeting 92% of the demand in the country. Second is manufacturing sector. Industrial activity is on the rise in the UAE to achieve sustainable economic diversification under the UAE Economy Version 2030. The government is targeting on increasing to the contribution of the manufacturing sector to the overall GDP from 11% to 25% by 2025. Therefore, the manufacturing sector is going up at rapid pace and is projected to reach 280 billion US by 2021. In the terms of revenue, the support from the government makes the manufacturing sector second only to the gigantic oils and gas market. For the service sector, the overall value of the UAE Facilities Management (FM) service market has been revised by relevant authorities to the current figure of AED 20 billion per annum, with an rise 10 to AED 25 until 30 billion by 2022. There are two main agencies which are Ministry of Human Resource and Administration (MOHIE) and the Ministry of Labour in UAE. MOHIE oversees the workforce and regulate to the employment process for both the commercial and private sector. In the past few years, numerous initiatives have been implemented to boost the job market in the countries and to create possibility to promote local talent. MOHIE allowed the employer a right to report a case in which an employee absconded without notifying the employer. For the Ministry of Labour, it is responsible for the administration of the labour market and forming and implementing the labour policy in the countries. Its aim is to achieve a balance between the interests of the workers, employer, and the society as a whole.
Law and regulation in UAE.
In UAE, there is no standard pay or minimum wage requirement under the UAE labor law. A basic wage is the wage mentioned in the employment contract that the company has agreed to pay the employee, excluding allowance for housing, transportation, and lodging. The basic wage is based on the employee's last drawn basic wage rather than their total wage. For the employment of women, it increased steadily from 2013 until 2017. However, it started to decrease dramatically, especially in 2020, which only recorded as 45.7% due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Women in the UAE participate actively in the private sector in various roles. They have equal rights to economic resources, including guaranteed equal pay, as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial service, inheritance, and natural resources in accordance with national laws. In UAE, the working hours is not more than 8 hours per day and 48 hours per week. Besides, employees may not have made to work more than 5 continuous hours per day without rest, meals, or prayer breaks. During Ramadan months, normal working hours will be reduced by 2 hours. If the overtime hours fall between 9 p.m. until 4 a.m., the additional overtime rate must be at least 50% of the standard wage. There are 7 types of leave that can apply by employees in UAE, which are maternity leave, sabbatical leave, conversional leave, Hajj leave, Umrah leave, parental leave, and sick leave. Maternity leave is for female workers in UAE. The female worker shall be entitled to a maternity leave of 60 days based on the first 45 days with full wage and the following 15 days with half leave. The female workers may, after using the maternity leave, be absent from work without a wage for a period not exceeding continuous or intermittent 45 days. A sabbatical leave is an extended period away from work. UAE workers who working in the private sector are entitled to a paid sabbatical leave, which is extended break from work to perform national service. During this time, employees are still employed and may still be paid. For compulsory leave, an employee of the private sector is entitled to a paid leave of 5 days in the event of the death of spouse and a paid leave of 3 days in the event of death of parents, child, sibling, grandchild, and grandparents. Employees may be granted special leave for the performance of Hajj under the provisions that the leave is given without pay, may not exceed 30 days, and grant only once during the employment with the company. The UAE labor law does not have any provision which entitle the employee to Umrah leave. If the employee requests an Umrah leave, it is up to the employer to concern and deduct it from the employee's annual leave or consider unpaid leave. Employees of the private sector are entitled to a parental leave of 5 working days from the days of the birth of their child to 6 months. Parental leave is a paid leave that can be applied for both mother and father of the baby. Moreover, 2 paid annual vacancy days are offered to employees with at least 6 months of employment but not less than 1 year. For sick leave, employer may request an official medical certificate as evidence of an employee's illness during their absence. Sick leave can entitle as full pay for the first 15 days, half pay for the next 30 days, and no pay for the remaining 60 days.
Termination benefits. Federal Law Number 8 of 1980 grants both employers and employees the right to terminate the employment contract should sufficient notice be given, and the circumstance fall within those defined by Ministry of Labour. During a 6-month term, the previous and new employers will be jointly responsible for executing the contract's requirement. When this period expired, the new employer have complete responsibility for the contract. First is repatriation of an employee. If the employee is not responsible for ending the contract, the employer is liable for repatriation costs. Second is employment ban. Employment label and work permit prohibitions can be enforced under certain conditions. Application for permits from individual facing a ban will be automatically denied. Under specific conditions, the prohibition may be lifted. Third is the end of service gratuity. Any employee who has completed at least 1 year of continuous service is entitled to end of service compensation upon termination of employment. When calculating the length of service, only paid work days are included. The compensation will be as follows: 21 days pay for each year of the first 5 years of service, 30 days pay for each additional years. However, the entire total remuneration should not exceed 2 years pay. Next, I will move to the employment of foreign workers. Foreign workers in UAE has increased steadily. Many immigrants, particularly those from underdeveloped nations, view the UAE as a country of opportunity. For example, a 38-year-old participant who works as a maid in Dubai revealed that she had left her 3 children with their grandmother since it was the only way she could ensure they had food. Furthermore, survival driver migrants are the most vulnerable. Most of them belong to the poorer sector of the country populations. They frequently assume any risk to travel overseas for work because they have no hope that life in their native nation will improve. Maximum retirement age. Although the retirement age for expat residents in UAE is 60 years, they are allowed to continue working till the age of 65 years, provided their employers can secure the necessary permits. However, employees who are above 60 years need to apply for work permits via MOHRE. The labor cards of employees who are above 60 also needs to be renewed annually. The work permits approval for seniors above 65 years cost AED 5,000 every 2 years. Child and labor law. According to the UAE labor law, an Emirati or an expatriate resident under the age of 15 is not eligible for an employment permit. However, youth between the age of 15 and 18 years may get a permit after Ministry of Human Resource and Emirates ensure that a written consent from the parent or the legal guidance of the minor is provided. A physical fitness certificate for the request word is issued by the competent medical authorities. Actual working hours do not exceed 6 hours per day and include 1 break or more. Minors are not made to work between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. Besides, Federal Law Number 3 of 2016 concerning child rights, also known as WEDMA laws, stress that all children must be provided with appropriate living standard, access to health service, education, equal opportunity in essential service and facility without any kind of discrimination. The law protects children against all forms of negligence, exploitation, physical and psychological abuse. Next, let's move to the suitable relate matters regarding employment scenarios, law and policies. Below are the systems that can be taken notes by the employees to ensure their interest in the working environment. First is insurance system. According to UAE Federal Law Number 8 of 1980 as amended, the employer is entitled to compensation for the employee in the event of the workplace injury. For this reason, it is recommended that the employer obtain the necessary insurance. This risk is covered in the UAE by the so-called workers' compensation insurance. Second, liability to social security. Social security contributions are applicable in the UAE only for UAE and GCC nations. If UAE and GCC nations are employed, then both the employer and employee will be required to make social security contribution to the General Pension and Social Security Authority (GPSSA). Third is Wage Protection System (WPS). In accordance with Ministry Decree No. Number 739/2016 concerning the protections of wage. All establishments registered with the ministry are required to pay their employees' wage on time via the Wages Protection System (WPS). Last is the kafala system, which means the sponsorship in Arabic. It is utilized in Gulf Cooperation Council nations, including the United Arab Emirates. The system enables the government to transfer the responsibility and monitoring of migrant workers and foreign investors by assigning them a native sponsor known as a kafel, who assume responsibility for the legal status and visa requirement of migrant laborers working for them.
Summary and differences: Malaysia versus United Arab Emirates.
In conclusion, we have compared the industrial relation systems in Malaysia and the UAE. Based on the Department of Statistics Malaysia, the total population in Malaysia is recorded as 32.75 million, while total population for UAE in 2022 is recorded as 10.08 million according to the World Bank. The major economic driver of both countries has a similarity, where both countries rely on the productions of oil, gas, and petroleum. For Malaysia, petroleum is not only the major economic driver, it also includes the productions of timber, electronics, rubbers, and automotive. Moreover, there is a formation of a nation's trade union in Malaysia, but trade unions are considered illegal in the UAE. It is same with the collective bargaining. In Malaysia, people who work in the private sector are allowed to collective bargaining, whereas workers who are employed in the public sectors are not allowed with it. However, in the UAE, either workers in the public sectors or private sectors are prohibited for participating in collective bargaining. Besides, the employment rates of women in the UAE in comparison are respectively higher than in Malaysia. Next, the minimum retirement age in Malaysia is 60 years old. It is the same with the UAE. Nevertheless, the UAE nations are allowed to continue working till the age of 65 years as long as the employee obtains the necessary permits. Last but not least, there is also social security laws in both countries. The Employee Provident Fund (EPF) is a federal statutory body under the purview of the Ministry of Finance. It manages the compulsory saving plans and retirement planning for private sector workers in Malaysia. While in the UAE, there are 4 systems that can be taken note of by the employees to ensure their rights and benefits, including the insurance systems, liability to social security, wages protection system (WPS), and kafala system. That's all from us. Thank you.